The Havighurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies turns 20 this academic year. The first conference we convened was held here in Oxford, Ohio in March 2001 on the theme of imagining Russia. A number of prominent scholars came to campus to talk about the state of the field. And we thought we'd use our 20th anniversary in 2020 to reimagine what we know about Russia through a series of conversations. And today we're going to talk Putin and Putinism. And I'm very pleased that Dr. Kathryn Stoner and Dr. Natalia Forrat are joining me. Dr. Stoner is the Deputy Director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, where she is also a Senior Fellow in the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and the Center on International Security and Cooperation. And Dr. Stoner was a participant in that first ever conference held here at Miami 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. Dr. Forrat is currently a visiting research associate and postdoctoral fellow at the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan, and is part of a newer generation of scholars studying the phenomenon of Putinism. So thank you both very much for joining me. And I'll start with a 2018 special issue of Comparative Politics that Kathryn, you co-edited, entitled Russia in Retrospect and in Prospect. And Natalia also contributed to this special issue. The issue was brought out in the wake of a conference marking the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution and the 25th anniversary of the beginning of an independent Russia. And given those two anniversaries, Kathryn, in your introduction, you wrote, "It's high time to evaluate what Russia has become. What kind of regime has evolved in those 25 years? What adjectives describe Russia after 18 years of Vladimir Putin's rule? What did analysts get right and wrong in understanding the currents of change in Russia? And what do Russians themselves think?" If we say 20 years now instead of 18 years, I think these questions are still apt. So maybe we'll start with that. The first question, maybe Kathryn first and then Natalia. What kind of regime has evolved in the now 25, 27 years since 1992?
So yeah, thanks for mentioning that piece. That was part of a conference that we did here, and Comparative Politics was good enough to make that a special issue. So the piece I particularly like in that, well, I like them all, but the piece I particularly like that I think addresses your question, Stephen, is Steve Fish's piece on what has Russia become, and you know, he calls it I think a populist, paternalist or neo-patronal populist autocracy. So a lot of adjectives that come in front of it. And I think basically, you know, the one thing is I just finished a book that's coming out shortly with Oxford University Press. It'll be out in February, called Russia Resurrected, and I had wanted it as a question mark, but they took the question mark away, and it's really about its power and purpose. But one of the things that under Putin, and one of the things that I had to answer in that book is also what has Russia become, and why has it become what it's become, and so I think Steve's basically right, but it's you know, it is a huge disappointment compared to 20 years ago when things we hoped looked a little bit different. Compared to 30 years ago, it's a tremendous disappointment. I was just asked by McGill University Press to write a short introduction to a series of lectures that they had, one of which was with Gorbachev in 1993. And so reading that and what his expectations were, and comparing, you know, what Russia has become, which is a non-democracy, an increasingly autocratic state, one where opposition is not welcome, is viewed as disloyal. The witness the poisoning of Navalny, the murder of Boris Nemtsov, and yet one that is not weak internationally, especially relative to, you know, its power resources on paper. So you know, it has become anti-Western, and it looks as though it's going to be stuck that way for the foreseeable future, what with the changes to the Constitution.
Natalia, do you agree? Are those the right terms to use? Steve Fish's ideas? You're part of, as I mentioned, a younger generation whose entire scholarly career has been with Putin in power.
You know, I generally, I don't disagree with that. And I totally agree on the point that compared to 20 years ago, it is a disappointment. But I think maybe a little bit to the contrary of me being the representative of a younger generation. Like in my research, I actually tend to look at a little bit longer historical perspective and more at the continuity. So definitely, if we compare it to the hopes that people had 20 years ago, it's a huge disappointment. But if we look at the Russian history in general, I am actually not that pessimistic about Russia's future. What we see on the surface now, yes, it is becoming more authoritarian. The regime is becoming more repressive. It is more anti-Western and all these things. They are all true. But at the same time, we see a lot of signs of maturity of Russian society, maturation, I would even say, not maturity yet, but maturation. And a lot of the things that happened in the past 20, 30 years, they have contributed to that maturation. Russians have never lived at the same kind of level of material, I would say, wealth. It has been stagnating for sure. But if you compare just the everyday life of ordinary Russians now and 30 years later, it's a stark contrast. And that impacts how people feel, how they think about their life, and how they think about politics. So I feel like all those signs of the regime becoming more repressive, those are actually the signs that there is more contention. There is growing contention between the regime and society in Russia. And the regime is repressive because, they don't have anything else left. They don't have any other means to deal with society other than repress. And that's a sign that society is resisting. So although all those things are true on the side of the regime, I would say that the prospects are probably not as, I'm hoping they're not as bad as some of the recent trends may suggest.
My own feelings about Russia ebb and flow and have over the years. When I visit, usually it's at a high point, and you go and you sit and have a nice coffee at the innumerable coffee shops that exist in the cities these days. And I think back, I did my dissertation research in 1999, right after the ruble collapse, which was that was a low in post-Soviet Russia, I think. So it's
Stephen, you're a child.
Yeah.
I used to haul my own food out to the provinces in the early 90s. But I would agree.
Just how much has changed, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sort of basic level. And I guess my question then, given that you both referenced the hopes people had in 2000 when Putin came to power, and it coincided with the upturn in the Russian economy. That's the logical next question, I think, from that special issue. Why were those hopes there, and what have scholars gotten wrong, do you think, over the years? And I remember when I first started here at Miami that everyone was talking about, is the Putin system a managed democracy? Is it a hybrid system? Is it an authoritarian system of a new type? So what's been right and what's been wrong about that? Maybe Natalia can start this time.
I think, again, to continue on the questions of continuity, I feel like what was wrong is that, right and wrong. People saw the fall of the Soviet Union, the period of the 90s, as a huge rupture. And in many ways it was. But at the same time, what people, I think, underestimated is how much Russia actually did not change. Despite the fall of the Soviet Union and despite the 90s, when the politics was more competitive, when everything was absolutely different, when the economy was changing completely. But at the same time, people's views and understandings of politics, they don't change that fast. They just don't. And that's why we have a lot of those effects of, the resentment and, the trauma of the fallen state, the great power that people felt they were a part of. And then suddenly it all fell apart. So, I feel like this is something that it's not like researchers didn't think about it at all. I definitely remember some voices reading some of the works that would make references to that, but I think we only start realizing the power of that factor only now. So this is something that probably people should have thought about a little bit more. On the other hand, it was really difficult to see from that vantage point. From like, if you were in the 90s, I just can't imagine how you could have figured it out. It's easy to see it now.
Yeah, the focus was so much on democratization. That seemed to be the focus
Absolutely,
of the time.
yes.
So, Kathryn, what about you? Agree with this? I realize this is also asking you to, in many ways, revisit your own work. What was right and wrong?
So, okay, well, my own work, initially, I worked on center periphery relations and provincial government. And so the first book I wrote, actually, that came out in, I think, 94, 95, was looking at 4 regions of Russia and then trying to figure out, why they got policy passed and whatnot. Unfortunately, I was right, because the places where, one of which was Nizhny Novgorod, when Boris Nemtsov was the provincial governor, the places where government functioned, not democracy necessarily, but where policy was made and implemented and the garbage was picked up and that sort of thing, in when the federal context was a mess, were successful not because they were more liberalized or quote unquote democratic. It was because they were company towns in the Soviet period. And so, at the end of that book, I said, well, in the short term, this might be a good thing because they can get these things done. In the long term, it's probably a negative thing for the growth of pluralism and possibly democratization, because these relationships shut other decision makers out. And at the risk of suggesting I was right, unfortunately, I think that's the way things have gone in many of those places, especially in view of the very weak institutionalization of things like political parties. And I think Natalia is right. That's partly a legacy from the Soviet period when institutions were, the formal rules were not really the rules that mattered. And I think that is something that has carried into the post-Soviet period. But it's not atypical of countries in transition, looking more broadly and comparatively, right? Russia, in that sense, is not so different. One thing I think that we constantly get wrong, and I find annoying in commentators and frankly policymakers in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, even until 5 years ago, and one of the things that made me write the book that I wrote was, I think there's a constant underestimation of Russia. Natalia, I want to emphasize her point about the maturation of Russian society. I think that is where Russia is changing and changed, and I think she's exactly right. This is why the regime gets more repressive, is because there's some modernization going on with attitudes, right? People now have more. The Russians have never lived so long, been so wealthy as they are right now. And so I think, frequently what we hear is that the economy is a disaster. They're weak, or they're a regional power, and they're actually not that at all. They've been pretty resilient. Putin's been pretty lucky in many ways in terms of oil prices and whatnot. But there has been some good, macroeconomic policy. I don't want to attribute that necessarily to Putin as much as to, their central banker. But Russia's proved itself to be very resilient. I think one big change, and I'd be interested in hearing Natalia's take on this, since she's a sociologist, is, there is now a generation of people who have grown up only under Putin, right? They've never known another president. Okay, Medvedev, but, he was not, it was still Putin running the show, we know now. I think that's a very big challenge for the regime. When we think about who's protesting, who kind of embraces Navalny's message, it's those younger folks, it's the YouTube generation, right? And so that is going to be an increasing challenge, I think, especially when you see things like, and then I'll stop talking, when you see things like, surveys of young people saying that they have plans to emigrate, and those numbers are up in the 60%. That is not the sign of a healthy regime, as capable as it has proven itself in some areas. If young people are not happy and see a brighter future for themselves abroad, that that's not a good sign, I think, for the further sustaining this kind of regime.
By the way, we're here to hear you talk, Kathryn, so don't apologize. And same for Natalia. But that you gave Natalia a question. I'm curious her thoughts on these. And I'm struck by the fact, yesterday we hosted a live interview with Victoria Lamasco, the graphic artist from Moscow. And she mentioned that, she made a recent trip to Minsk and was really struck by the fact that these sort of generational attitudes, that entire groups of people that have grown up only under Lukashenko or now only under Putin are what are driving certain changes and attitudinal changes within both of these societies. So your thoughts on this, Natalia?
Yeah, I generally agree with that, because I don't think that the fact that they have never witnessed political competition is a factor at all, because I believe that probably in all contexts, but in the context of Russia, modernization actually works. It works at the level of society. And it is true that this is a YouTube generation. They're not as stuck to one source of information. That matters. It is true that also, these people, they have very different kind of opportunities in life. Their upbringing was very different. Even parenting practices have changed over the generations. It's something that is referred to as unbeaten generation. And actually that matters. I actually think that does matter, because the way they treat violence, the way they do not accept violence, and it starts from domestic violence and it ends with state violence, that also matters. So I think all that feeds into kind of this slight erosion of state authority. Because one thing that is definitely feeding Russian authoritarianism is the authority that the state has in society. And generally, the authority of the state is not synonymous to authoritarianism. It's actually also a necessary component of democracy. But the monopoly of the state on political power, on leading the collective action, that's definitely something that is not healthy. And I think the younger generation is in much better position to break that monopoly. And this is what they're starting to do by diversifying their sources of information, by protesting, by not accepting violence, by doing something together beyond the state realm. So, and yes, it will be a growing challenge. I don't think that's going to be necessarily an overnight revolution. I actually don't believe that's going to be the case, but it will be growing. I don't see how you can, put that back into some kind of box in the contemporary world.
Yeah. One of the things that I think unites your work, you've given me a natural segue here, is how that you both study how one builds and sustains a contemporary authoritarian system and autocracy, whatever we want to call the Putin system. And in doing so, you also bring up ideas of how they have legitimacy, or maybe seek to have legitimacy. And you both, I think, note that traditional views of authoritarian systems don't rely, those that rely solely on like repression or co-optation are too narrow for us to understand the Putinist system. In your forthcoming book, Kathryn, that you referenced earlier, that at least the blurbs I read of it, you argue that Russia has pursued a domestic gets domestic legitimacy from international influence. It's Russia resurrected ? And Natalia, of course, your research and book projects argue that Russia's pursued a solidarity-based authoritarianism to gain support among the population. And you've paid particular attention to the role of teachers in the Putinist system. Reading your articles, I was really struck by this, the higher education in general and teachers. And I really like the phrase you use about them, shock-resistant autocracy is how you describe the Putinist system. So the question for you both then is, how can we better understand Putinism by expanding our views of the way authoritarian regimes work? And even more specifically, what are the sources of Russian state legitimacy, and maybe what are some of the weaknesses? You alluded to that at the end of your answer, Natalia, but maybe you want to start and pick that up a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. So to the question of what is exactly feeding kind of authoritarianism at the bottom level. My article was about teachers, but actually teachers is only a small part of the story. Teachers were crucial for one particular thing, for falsifying elections. But if we think like broader about why do people accept this authoritarian power, it was a question for me, not only a research question, it was almost a personal question, because I grew up in Russia. I grew up actually in a city that was surrounded by barbed wire, and it had a nuclear plant there. So many people would see it as almost a prison, but for me, it was my motherland. That's where my family, my friends, my childhood memories and things. And then everything collapsed, and the views on what is good and what is bad were, not only did they change, they weren't really there. People were very confused. And then I also had an experience of migrating to the US, and I really struggled understanding this bottom level motivations of people. And now that I'm finishing writing my book, I think I figured out an answer for myself. And I think the answer is, first, people are not, like, Russian people are no different absolutely from people anywhere in the world. But what is different is how societal, like, social life is organized. And if you think about why Russian people accept that authoritarian regime, think about someone in the US who is surrounded by their social group, let's say by some conservative group, and they are liberal. They want to be liberal, right? And imagine how difficult it is for them to go against their social environment, how difficult it is for them to express their individuality, given that everyone else agrees on something else. Something like that happens in Russia. The difference is that that group, that collective that holds everyone together is the state. And that has been the case for centuries. Russian people didn't choose it, they were born into it. They're just like everyone else, they live in groups. They want to be conformist to a degree to their social environment, because we cannot keep fighting each other. We have to align our views, our reactions, our behavior to be able to live together. And that's what they do. The problem is that when you only have one group, one authority, when you have monopoly on that kind of political authority, on group authority, then people who have that monopoly may start abusing you. And this is what happens. And it's very difficult to resist that abuse. You have to really go against part of yourself, part of what you think you are, because Russian people associate themselves very much with the state. And in my research, what I was doing, I was looking at different regions in Russia, because Russia is also diverse and different regions have different histories. And in some regions, the state is really powerful for a lot of historical reasons, and in others, it's not. Usually those are the regions somewhere on the border that have a history of being between the big powers and resisting all of them. And the history of different local groups, ethnic, religious, some other groups organizing their social life. So, and that's where we see a lot of competitiveness, and that's where authoritarianism actually works the way we are used to think about authoritarianism, through repression, through buying people's loyalty, through all kinds of deals, through private deals, through all these, politics that are going like beyond the rules, beyond the institutions. But what is going on in the places where the state has an authority? It's actually the opposite. People do not break private deals with the rulers. They don't want their own gain. They don't put their own interests over the collective interests, over the citizenship, let's say, civic duty. They prioritize collective interest, and this is what backfires. Because that collective interest starts suppressing individual rights, starts abusing them, and they have trouble. What's interesting, if you go to Russia, people are not happy with the state. They criticize it all the time. If you find someone who is really happy with the state, I would be very surprised, because even if they're happy with not one aspect, they're definitely unhappy with another. But the problem for this is to organize against the state. This is something that is really difficult for them.
A very good reminder. So Kathryn, your thoughts on this, which is a way of also saying, tell us a little more about this forthcoming book and how you argue how the Putinist system derives some legitimacy and support from its international reputation.
Right. So I can do that. I guess part of it is One thing I think in terms of sources of legitimacy, well, it's been performance, right? And so if the Russian state is able to provide for its citizens' needs, then its legitimacy is relatively high. And I think that's the story of 2003 to 2010, maybe 8, when even though there's the huge crash in 2008, there's a pretty good recovery, actually pretty quick in 2009, 10. Then we get dips again. Putin comes back in. People aren't happy about that. So they do organize. They do go out on the street in Moscow and other big cities as well. And he's shaken by that, clearly. So I think this is the modernization story that Natalia was referring to, right? Seymour Martin Lipset, which is, it wasn't the losers of his growth that were out on the street. It was the winners. It was the new middle class. And, they're yelling, Россия без Путина, Russia without Putin. That, I think, was completely unexpected by Putin. And so then you begin to see a crackdown. And so where my book really starts is should we have been surprised by grabbing Crimea? When he does do that, and the evidence is it's a pretty spontaneous decision. It's something they had on the shelf, it pulled off. And so his approval ratings go up pretty notably after that. And they go from low 60% to a high 80%. And they stay up pretty high until really last year, 2019. And you can see that, what Putin fears is not so much NATO and Russia being invaded, and that's part of the argument of the book, is the street, right? That's what can really bring him down. And so in terms of organization, I largely agree with Natalia, but I want to point to Havighurst, at which until just this past weekend, there were huge, huge protests going on. And in 2019, there were protests against all kinds of things, not necessarily Putin, but, things that even provincial governments were doing, putting a church in a park, that kind of thing. That is, that is an interesting problem for them the state to manage, the regime, I want to say, to manage, because, there's a decision that Chinese had to make about how much steam do you let off, the pot when it's boiling before it boils over. So I think this is these are calculations that have to be made as well. I think the other big issue that is a potential weakness is inequality. What is bringing kids out onto the street in 2017, 2018? It's inequality. It's I'm sick and tired of not getting into the school I want because I didn't have the right connections, or I, didn't have enough money to induce an administrator to let me in. This is becoming, that the rules are not fair or they're not consistent, and they're getting bigger and bigger social inequalities. That's a problem for regime legitimacy as well. So, partly the argument of my book is, we look for legitimacy elsewhere, which is abroad, and look at what a great power we are, what we've become. And it turns out that Russia has some pretty significant capabilities, more than we would think, and certainly enough to destabilize. They don't have to be the best at everything. They can be good enough to, especially when the US is withdrawing internationally from previous international commitments in the Middle East, even in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, as we have sanctioned with our European allies, such as they are at this point, as we have sanctioned Russia for 2014 and for interference in 2016. Russia has gone, and under Putin, I don't want to say it's Russia, there's no Mr. Russia, my colleague Mr. McFall would say, Russia has, under Putin, has gone and reestablished relationships. And so the economy has not suffered to the extent that we might have expected and many predicted because of the sanctions. They found alternative markets, gradually building up a tighter and tighter relationship with China. We should be afraid of that and concerned about that. And, the United States, in terms of its own foreign policy, is not being well led to meet such a challenge. this regime is perfectly capable and willing, most importantly, and unchecked largely, from making, snap, quick, aggressive decisions. They did it in Ukraine, in Syria, interference with our elections, interference across Europe, and interference currently, allegedly, as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. It's in many ways a good way to conclude, and also I'm glad you brought up the Far Eastern protests, which I was going to ask you about as well, about whether or not I guess the answer here is time will have to tell us if Putinism will still be the gold standard of contemporary autocracies, as was mentioned in that special issue, or still shock resistant, to use Natalia's terms. A last quick question. I'm always interested in hearing what smart people recommend, especially historians like me, to read about the contemporary Russia. So what books or particularly insightful articles would you recommend for listeners to this to read, to really grasp these nuances of Putinism? Maybe Natalia first.
Well, I guess since I'm so much in writing my own book and I'm really following what is being published in terms of, this bottom level kind of politics, the grassroots politics in Russia, I would say that the work of Graham Robertson and Sam Green, as well as the work of
Hey, I was going to say that.
I was first.
Okay, go ahead.
So I think, I'm building on their work, and I think they're really going in the right direction. They're really trying to grasp that part that I'm particularly interested in, like the motivations of ordinary Russians to support Putin's regime, and not to assume that they're doing it because there is some kind of authoritarian gene that Russians have, or because they were suppressed, or they actually give voice to people. They give them agency to make choices, even if those choices may not be liked by someone, and even if they may lead to very tragic consequences for them and for other countries and for other peoples. But I think they're really getting at the kind of the core of those social roots of authoritarianism. So I would definitely recommend their work.
You've had time to think of other people, and Gulnaz will no doubt listen to this sometime, and we'll be happy to hear you reference her, Natalia. She was my colleague here for years.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, love Gulnaz. We had her earlier too, at Stanford last year. So I would say yes. So Robertson and Green's Putin versus the People. I think that's a great book, and I use that in my book too. I would also say The Code of Putinism, Brian Taylor. That's I think very useful book in terms of explaining elite relationships. Since you've started to focus more on society, I'll go back to elites. And then, of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Karen Dawisha's excellent book before she passed away, Putin's Kleptocracy. And I think those are all very useful. Russia's a very, very complex place, and there's so many different things that you could look at. But I do think state and society relations are really determinative of Russia's future, because those are changing, and we'll see how long Mr. Putin can keep the top on the low boil, because I don't think it's forever.
Those are great work. Go ahead, Natalia.
I would just add that I totally agree on state-society relations, and I think this is the part that may be the hardest to grasp for a Western observer.
Yeah, right.
And
outsiders more generally, I think. Yeah,
exactly. Because for people who grew up in pluralistic societies, it is really not intuitive to understand why people behave the way they behave in Russia. And even for someone like me who migrated from one system to another, it's actually not easy to talk about those differences. We don't really have a good language to talk about them. So that's why, not only because they are important politically, but I think because they are the most difficult part to understand about Russia. That's why they're important.
Right. I also think actually, just last thing, Steve, sorry. I think it's also difficult to understand for a leader isolated in the Kremlin or isolated right now outside of, just outside Moscow, where you have to go through a tube apparently to see Putin, a disinfection tube. Don't forget that Russia changed as Brezhnev slept, right? Is the quote people think. I think Russia's changing as Putin is losing touch with people. It was happening before COVID and it's happening now. He was clearly taken aback, insulted even by the protests against his return in 2011, 2012. And so I think that there is probably a lack of understanding as well in the Kremlin about what society wants, what it needs, and what to provide to pacify people.
I tell my students frequently that, Russia in the last 30 years has had two major upheavals. That is, the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also the protests you referenced in 2011 is proved capable of surprising us again and again in ways that we should expect, but yet somehow don't. So those are both great concluding remarks. Thank you, Natalia and Kathryn, for joining us and allowing us to reimagine Russia again.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.